Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Traumaplicity talk show, which is trauma plus simplicity equals Traumaplicity. And it means simple steps to healing trauma. And trauma can often be a complex type of a situation. And in order to really start healing, the brain needs to know it can be simple, one little thing at a time. And so my name is Dr. Amanda Helman. I am your host today, December 29th of 2021. And we are almost into the new year, really exciting. But I'm really thrilled to have my friends here, Chris and Jess Engler. And they, hello there, and they are on our final episode of the year, which is really exciting, and sharing part of their story. And so I've known Chris and Jess for a while. We, Chris and Jess, actually, they support my personal, website and just do a lot with technology. So Chris and Jess, you'll probably do a better job than I am with some of this. And they also have Mom, is that right?
Yeah, Mighty Oak Ministries.
Mighty Oaks Ministry, yeah. Okay. Mighty Oaks Ministry, and they again have a heart for community, heart for people, and are truly compassionate people. So certainly, and all about family. So glad to have you. You can both embellish on what I said, but certainly anything you'd like to add.
I think you hit it with family. That's what Chris and I do. Wherever we go, we cultivate family. You can put a lot of words behind that. A lot of titles, but in the heart of everything we do, I'm a mom, he's a father in the kingdom, and we bring family wherever we go. We gather in the orphans and help them find identity to know that they are the sons and daughters of Christ. So that's like the heart of our ministry. As for, work, yeah, we do, websites, and we help other people like yourself, other ministries or small businesses find their audience. And that's kind of the gist of what we do in a very small nutshell.
There you go.
A lot of other stuff, but
many things in between.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I wanted to at least, allow you to share that. So thank you. And so we're on today talking about topics. Trauma is not always easy, but there's stories of overcoming, and we're humans. So human beings, we are all full of our own stories of overcoming and heartaches, joys and processes. So I just wanted to bring both of you on and ask for you to share what is part of your story that our audience can hear and take away some of that overcoming.
Yeah, sure. Want me to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I've been thinking about this for a little while. If you know me for a long time, you'll hear about my childhood. Right, childhood trauma, and overcoming that. It's also part of, like where Jess was saying, family. It's part of, we like to save people from the fire, right? We like to try to prevent the trauma before it even happens. So that's a good part of what we do. But I wanted to actually talk about a trauma that a lot of us, we don't talk about. And it happens to you while you're an adult. So what I'd like to talk about is losing a job. What happens when you lose a job? For me, Jess and I, we started out really young. How old were you when we met, hon?
14.
Yeah, 14. I was 17. Took her off the market real early. And, I already had a son on the way when Jess was, when we met Jess. And when my son was born, I was 17 years old. And, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. And all I had this thing in my head that I just wanted to be a better father than my own. Not that I don't have a relationship with my father, but it was there. And I joined the Army. I served in the Army for 4 years. Jess and I started having children, and it was not a conducive lifestyle to what we needed to be or what we wanted to be for a family. So I got out of the Army, and I was airborne infantry and didn't have any real life skills for the corporate life. So I didn't know what I was going to do. I found a temporary job working for Guardian Life Insurance, opening mail and depositing incoming checks. Right? I worked my way up the corporate ladder while Jess raised our children for 17 years. So for 17 years, I worked with this company. I was doing well, got my master's degree, got my, like, going through schooling and everything. Everything was happening, right? Everything was good. I was an executive, and, you know, we were just launching like all the time. Like, I always had my eyes on building Guardian Life Insurance. And you know, Guardian is still a good company and everything, but what happened was they sold my business unit, and hundreds of us lost our jobs. And this was back in, I think, 2017, 2018. But anyway, hundreds of us lost our jobs, and there was nothing that I did wrong. There was nothing anybody did wrong other than, you know, the unit was sold. When that happened to me, and it happened to hundreds of others, I went through a significant trauma. Do you ever ask someone what they do? You're like, hey, I'm Chris. You know, you're Jess. Jess, what do you do? You know, like you identify with your job or the career or the problem that you solve. And what I tried to do my whole life was not to have an identity in my job. So when people would say, hey, you know, Chris, what do you do? I'm like, hey, I'm a father, or I'm a husband, right? I never said I'm a manager for Guardian Life Insurance. Like, it just wasn't out of my mouth. But when I lost my job, I had an incredible amount of my self-worth wrapped inside of that job. And it was traumatic. At one point, I remember weeks after the layoff, hiding up inside of my boy's room, weeping, just crying, like crawled up in a ball. And Jess called up the steps. She's like, honey, what are you doing? And I'm like, crying. She's like, why? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know why I'm crying. I'm just so sad. Anyway, you know, it took a while to recover. So that's like a real thing. People will dedicate their lives to a purpose or a cause, and then that is taken away for whatever reason. And that is significant, significant trauma.
Yeah.
So
Want to talk about some of yours?
I'm actually going a completely different route. So yeah, you know, as Chris said, you know, we really had a much longer time. Chris and I had very traumatic childhoods from different aspects, and that's going to take way more than a half an hour. And so when I was thinking about what to share, I know that right now what I'm dealing with is enough. So I'm actually recovering from a pretty significant head trauma that happened back in April. And then in December, I had my 9th concussion. So I've had 9 head injuries in my life. Some of them were during my childhood. I cracked my skull open 3 times. And then I've had all these other things happen. Each one of my concussions has trauma attached. Now, some of them are silly, like the one where my dog plowed me over and took my sled and left me unconscious in the snow. You know, there's not a lot of trauma attached to that, except for my dog, you know, left me unconscious in the snow. But some of the injuries I had have significant trauma. And when I had the hit in April, what I was very unprepared for was the unsurfacing, the resurfacing, I guess is the right word, of past trauma. And so I think that's what I would like to talk about, how it's very, you know, sometimes we think we're better, or we think that is as deep as it is, and we kind of like go on with our lives and put a nice little coating on top of it, and then all of a sudden we hit something, and with me it was an actual pretty bad head injury, and everything has now opened. And and I went through reliving some of past traumas, like actually not dreaming of them, not remembering them, because I never really forgot them, but like being in there again and feeling the head injury and feeling the fear and all the things that were attached to trauma. And so, you know, I think that's what I wanted to share today, is about the physical and the spiritual and the mental all being attached to trauma, and how, we are a being with three parts, and you can't just omit one. So, as you feel something in your physical flesh, right, whether it's an abuse or a car accident, or there's so many ways trauma can come at you, it affects our mental state, it affects our spiritual state. And often we focus on healing the physical. Like, I'm in tons of therapy right now. I go to vision therapy. I've done occupational therapy. I've done cognitive therapy. I'm doing physical therapy a second time to heal the damage to my occipital lobe. And of course, tons of prayer. I believe God can heal. But I'm dealing with all the physical stuff that my doctors are telling me to do. I have a team of doctors helping me deal with 9 concussions that have now all come to a head. But what I'm also trying to do is steward the emotional attachments to each trauma, the emotional things that like hooked along. I had to do an exercise today at physical therapy that involved me walking backwards. And I said to the woman, this is very strange, but the whole time I'm walking backwards, I'm terrified somebody's gonna hit me in the back of the head. And it's not realistic. I'm at my doctor's office, but there's a trauma attached to that. And those are the things that we often ignore. It's those emotional connections and those spiritual things that keep us stuck. And so when I first hit my head, I actually hit my head 2 days in a row. That's what took me to the severe head trauma. I went to God and I was like praying. I'm like, Lord, I know you can heal. Like, why am I going through this long, agonizing process of healing? And I really felt like he said he's after a bigger fish, that my brain is open and there's all this past stuff that has to be healed, dating all the way back to infancy and things that happened to me as a child. And so I feel like even though trauma, we want it to go away, right? When we're being hurt, we want to just kind of make the pain stop, make it stop, assess the physical damage, and pretend that the emotional and the spiritual never happened. And here I am, 42, assessing trauma that happened to me in my very young years, because it wasn't properly healed. It wasn't just properly healed physically, because I have all this damage to my brain that has not been healed, but it hasn't healed in my heart. It hasn't healed in my spirit. And so I'm now having to fix that correctly. And I think, to me, that's my biggest warning for trauma, is to not rush the process and allow the complete work. And that it's a 3-part thing. It's physical, emotional, and spiritual.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go to both of you, but Chris, thank you for sharing about the trauma of losing your job, and even just the identity piece of that, and the grief and loss, and a big part of it, because most people, we tend to say, how are you doing in terms of like your identity and work and everything else. And it's really, it's rare that you have people say, how are you feeling? Or how are you being, right? We don't do that. How are you doing? And so that is a big piece, especially like when you talked about like being a provider and feeling like this is a huge piece of who you were and having that season. So for those of you in the audience that were listening, and perhaps you have questions for Chris and you can relate to that, and especially probably in the last 2 years, I'm sure a lot of us may be relating in different areas of what is my identity, not maybe just in work, but what is my identity? So it is a really critical piece. And then Jess, and I've known about your journey, some of it, obviously the last part that you just shared, of course, me with what I do is like, oh, I didn't know those pieces. But like, the additional things from childhood, of course, in my brain, I'm like, ooh, anyway, we'll talk about that later. But looking at that stuff, it is. And we don't realize, because as you said, okay, now I'm like dealing with stuff that I didn't before. And some of it you kind of get to, but that's the big thing with trauma, is that, if you look at research, it says, well, we're so resilient when we're kids. They're so resilient. They've had so much stuff in the brain. MRI showed like the difference, because we can't handle what we don't know how to speak about. And so we're later, and then all of a sudden, right, if we don't do it, if we want to get healing, there is the time, or sometimes people don't because it's just hard. But if we started it, that it does come up, and we don't know like what might, interrupt it for you. You had no idea that you were going to have to go back, and that this stuff was part of this that you didn't even realize. Not that it was like, ooh, this is supposed to happen, right? But that in this, it's like the good of it, right?
Mhm.
Trying to look at the good of what might be, is that you're having this deeper healing, and who knows what the bigger fish, right, will be. But it's not easy, this journey of like doing this. I mean, I've definitely heard that. And so some of you who are out there who've maybe had different types of traumas, maybe you've had head trauma, or you can relate to this, or something happened where all of a sudden you're dealing with the emotional part, and you thought you dealt with something. And that's why it's probably rare now today for me to ever say, well, I'm done with that. There's no way. Because as soon as I say that, forget it, right? And so there's that ongoing deeper healing. So those of you out there in the audience, if you can relate to that, if you have questions about what that might look like, or maybe you're like, oh my gosh, like that has been happening to me, and who do I go to? Certainly you can reach out to Chris or Jess for the different areas, but Jess for that.
Mhm.
And so those are, both very important areas. So I had to like comment for both of you in terms of those. And then when we look at, again, right, trauma and different processes, it could be one acute trauma or multiple traumas, one event or many events ongoing. But when we're looking at simple steps of how do I begin a process of starting to shift, right? So like Chris, you were talking about your work identity, maybe some simple things that helped you, that if I'm an audience, like practical things, and just for you, like some simple things that just helped okay, one little thing at a time, one little small step. So I don't know if Chris, you want to start, since you started on the first thing, and then Jess.
Mhm.
So simple steps.
Mhm.
First thing is you have to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
It's easy for all of us just to bury it down, suck it up. How many times do you hear people say, suck it up? Like, just keep going. But sometimes it's real and it's there, and you have to acknowledge that it's there.
Mhm.
So step one, you're not going to heal unless you recognize it and you start to address it. Wounds can go on, trauma can go on for many, many years, completely unaddressed, until one day, boom. Yeah.
Mhm.
So first step, acknowledge it. You're a human being and you have feelings, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Number two, find someone you can talk to. When you start, you acknowledge it and you start reaching out to people to talk to, right? I am blessed that I have a wife. Not everyone has. Like Jess is amazing. Like, she's an amazing wife. She's been by my side essentially my whole life. We've been together more in years than I was alive, right? More than, like, we've been together. She's my confidant. Not everybody has that. And when you start reaching out, get help, even if you have to pay for a counselor, to get a third party. One of the sad things is when you start addressing trauma and you start looking for someone to talk to, you really start to realize who your real friends are. People will walk away. People don't like injured people sometimes. People you thought were your friends or your support system all of a sudden aren't. And that's difficult, but keep pressing in. There are people out there with like genuine hearts to listen to you and be a support system. Find those people. Find them. It's important. You're not meant to do anything alone. Anything alone.
Yeah, and I would say, even though the traumas that we're discussing are very different, I think the steps are very similar. Like, the first thing I would say is, I agree with Chris, acknowledge. So often we bury it. Some of the childhood stuff, I'm a very strong person. I like to be strong. And I'm like, I'm fine. It made me stronger, right? This is a kill you, make it strong, makes you stronger. And I'm not a very emotional person. I keep my emotions very clear. I address them quickly. But with this situation, I really had to go back to the beginning and allow myself to feel things that my childhood self wasn't able to, because I had to survive. And I had to assess things inside of me that got broken at a very young age. And so there's this level of acknowledgement and feeling that has to happen. And I'm not going to lie to you, that part is painful. And that's where a lot of people quit, because there was I had like 4 significant visions, like visions, but like trauma memories that was like, I came out of them with complete panic attacks because I really thought I was back there. And it hurts, and it's so deep. But if I would have shut it down then, I would have never been able to actually properly address it. You think about when you break an arm and it heals improperly, you have to re-break the arm, and that's painful. And so I would say acknowledging and feeling is huge. I would, for me, during all of that, I find my center. So like, even like physical, because I have like some dizzy spells or whatever, like I center myself emotionally with, okay, I am alive. I am well. It is a new day. I center myself with my physical surroundings. My feet are flat on the ground. I count to 10. And some people, whether it's a physical trauma or not, they actually have to go back to what their physical body is doing to bring their emotions back in check. So I'll do like this 10-second moment of my feet are flat. The world isn't moving. I am breathing to center myself. And then of course, spiritually, like who is my strength? And I come back to that. And I use that a lot. I use that a lot to get through really difficult moments. And I agree with Chris, finding somebody to confide in. Now, my family has been very supportive during this. And of course, Amanda, I've spoken to you. I've had a lot of other people come and pray for me and speak to me. But I recently joined a support group. Because I felt like everyone speaking into my life, nobody actually understood what it's like to have your brain get scrambled and you become a different version of yourself. And the person you are is over here, and now here you are, and you can't find that person anymore. And I don't think I'm supposed to. I'm going to be a different person when this is done. And I do think I'm supposed to. But during that process, you literally turn on your own self. And so I needed to find people who understood that process and understood the journey. And I found I was invited to this wonderful support group from a friend. And I'll tell you what, just listening to their stories and being able to speak into their bad days has been it just has been a light at the end of the tunnel, because not only do I get that support, I'm able to give support, and that gives me purpose. It means that my journey wasn't in vain. And so for me, that has been my steps to healing with trauma appropriately and celebrating it, celebrating it. I think that celebration and worshiping and being joyful in the midst of what was meant to destroy us is like the best testimony. So so I'll say that's my last step.
Well, thank you.
One more step. I know that everyone that listens to this isn't going to be like uber religious. Right? Okay. For me specifically, believing that there's a God that loves me no matter what, no matter how bad I screw things up, that helps me significantly. It takes a lot of pressure off of myself to be perfect. I realize that it's okay to, acknowledge the trauma, seek help. 3, know that I don't have to be perfect. Even if it takes a long time to get through the trauma, to get to the steps, it helps me understand or believe that there's somebody greater, like a greater power than I, and that greater purpose. That's a significant release for me.
So. Greater purpose to it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So just to recap those really great steps, the first step is, and you both agreed on that, is I'm acknowledging there's trauma that needs to heal so that you can move forward. And then, beginning those steps to actually begin looking at what is it, right? And then I know differently, or Jess, you brought up a good point of, okay, I found a support group that was people that can recognize I'm not alone. A lot of times we're all different, right? Chris's, trauma, like my trauma, all of our traumas are different. But sometimes when we just have another group where someone's like, hey, I can relate, and you can relate to them, And even if other people try to, they can't necessarily understand exactly what that means with your brain, like you said. So it does bring something like, oh my goodness, okay, like they're also experiencing this. Yeah, you're not alone.
I'm not alone. And that is huge.
It is huge.
Not alone.
It is huge. And that's excuse me.
That's okay.
And that's a big part of it, and I think a lot of times, anytime with traumaplicity, because of what happens with that, the hurt and pain, and that's most people. I don't think without family stuff from all of us on the world that we haven't all had pain. And so I think sometimes we may feel isolated, like we can't, there's always someone that can relate,
Yeah.
So do you have, and then of course, for those of you who are believers, God was a big part of it. And that is a big piece of the traumaplicity for a lot of people. Excuse me, I keep coughing.
Do you need a drink?
Huh?
You need to get a drink?
I'll be okay. One last question you can help me out with, and I'll be okay. What if you had encouragement for the audience, what would it be?
Okay, so I'm going to share this. So when I first, so I'm going to make this as quick as I can. So one of my favorite things to do in my house is I have this sunroom and I love watching the birds. And every morning I go down and I watch the birds, and we get all kinds of them. And my favorite thing about springtime is to watch the hummingbirds, and the hummingbirds cover my front bushes. I get tons of hummingbirds, and they fly up at the window and they'll literally watch me. Like they watch me as much as I watch them. And so that's one of my favorite things to do. Well, I hit my head. The big one was in April. And so that May, I was still in recovery, serious recovery. Like I had memory loss, everything. It was a very significant hit. And so the one morning I was sitting in my sunroom and I was watching the hummingbirds, and all of a sudden I saw a hummingbird at rest sitting on a branch, which I've never in my life seen before. And I heard the Lord very clearly say to me, even the hummingbird rests. And so I was like, that's cool, whatever. And that happened a couple more times. And each time and there's a couple more days, I saw a hummingbird at rest again. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. And then after I think it was like the third time, I was like, oh, I'm the hummingbird. I'm the hummingbird. And it was this moment of understanding the importance of being at rest. And so I would say that is my biggest advice to anybody going through trauma, is that you are allowed to stop things to be at rest. You are allowed to say no to things. You are allowed to not attend things. You are allowed to take breathers. Your peace is essential to your healing, and guard it. And nothing is more valuable than your peace. And so that's something that I had to learn, is that I had to take a step back and say, no, I'm at rest. And during this time of rest, there's things that I'm going through and I'm healing, but I can't do that if my wings are flapping a million miles a second. So I would say that's my biggest piece, is take the season of rest to heal properly. And it is okay to say no to things, because I am a doer. I'm a hummingbird, I'm constantly doing a million things. But during the season, I have learned to just be at peace with no, and I'm at rest now. And I even fail at rest all the time. I want you to know I'm not good at it, but I'm getting better. So, I would say that's my biggest piece of advice.
Yeah. Hey, I told you I had an awesome life. Is she awesome? Get a support. I'm telling you. So for me, my best advice, Jess's advice is better, but here's another piece. Try to get out of a victim mentality.
That's a good one.
I was hearing, I'm hearing all of this, right? And I'm thinking, boy, it's so easy to say that this happened to me and I'm a victim.
Acknowledge
and
release.
And part of that is true, right? Yeah. But you need to allow yourself to switch your thought processes from a victim to a survivor, and then a survivor to an overcomer.
Yep.
Like that's your process. That's your path, right? Like when I was talking about the layoff, right? Guardian's a good company. It's not my fault. Like I lost my job, and really it's not their fault. They lost job. I lost my job either. They're a company. They're our expectation, my expectation. Anyway, the bottom line is it's okay to be a victim. right? But you don't stay there.
Yep.
Become a survivor. And then after you've become the survivor, become the next thing, which is the overcomer, because you're going to overcome it. You have to allow yourself to go through that process.
Yeah, that I would agree that is essential. You know, we've ministered to a lot of people, you know, and some people stay in a victim mentality, and we get to a point where there's not much more we can do to bring them on the other side of the trauma, whether it be abuse or just, you know, a traumatic moment. You know, it doesn't matter what it is. If you keep yourself as a victim, you will be re-victimized and re-victimized and re-victimized. So there's a fine line of acknowledging, feeling, and then there's that moment of releasing. Because if you don't release it, you'll relive that trauma over and over and over again, and you'll never escape. And so I would agree that Chris's is essential. It is so essential. You know, I definitely had a pity me party for a little bit in the beginning of this. You know, like, you know, I did, and he did too when he was crying up in the bedroom. You know, but I'm kind of a toughie. I'm the one that says suck it up. You know, that's me. And I'm like, okay, that's enough now. Like, you know, let's embrace this layoff. Let's see what God's doing in this. But, you know, he could have easily stayed on that floor and never got up again, and we wouldn't be where we are today. And the same with me. Like, I could still be sitting there wallowing in the fact that my old self is not here anymore. I'm new and I'm different. And instead of embracing what the Lord is birthing through this process, you know, and I think that's essential. Like, what the trauma you can allow trauma to hinder you, or you can allow it to birth something beautiful. What's the choice really comes down to each of us.
Yeah, and those are great points, especially I think from Jess, I know you shared a lot about learning from the hummingbird, but the rest is a promise. And a lot of times I think, oh, rest is just like there's different things of rest. It's like learning how to there's just a huge piece. And once we learn rest is ease and flow, right? We're in everything, and it's a different place. Like, we're not moved. And, you know, so I think that's really important. And I think, and I appreciate, like, you know, as you both have talked about these different, you know, just even sharing encouragement to the audience, you know, and even like Chris, you know, as you were sharing, and I know you like kudoed, you know, Jess for what she was sharing, but even for you, like to look at, you know, going from the victim to survivor to overcomer and even thriver. But there's like ebb and flow with it, because again, like sometimes there's such a strong, because sometimes it's not just individual, it's generational. You know, there's some big stuff with it. And I think you kind of both allude to, it's almost like a lot of times I've heard, I'm not ready, or I've even said that in my life, or I didn't know that, but internally I didn't say it. So one of the big things, I'll just say it, and because I love to, like, I want to see people helped. One of the biggest things I had to learn is giving myself permission to feel, to heal. And I think the biggest turnaround for me now, that I believe, because you know, God taught me this, was that, you know, I learned growing up, and I think this is a cultural thing. This is my passion, actually. The whole world weeps, I'll be happy, because that's strength. And so I know that sounds weird, you know, God's joyful, but he's also, Jesus wept, you know, Jesus wept, even though he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. I mean, my goodness. And so that speaks volumes, you know. And I think the biggest hindrance in families, because I had to undo this, is that in family lines, we were taught, you have to be strong, don't cry. And I had to break that. Like, God broke that in me, you know, and because with a kid in Haiti, you know, but there's different things he does. And I had to shift it, because my whole motto, kind of like you, Jess, my whole life was like, I'm strong because I'm not crying. Right. But that's like a vow I made to myself that had to break. And now I'm like, I'm strong because I cry. And in fact, it was funny, because the other day I had someone read my book, and she's like, you cried a lot. I was like, I did. Some of it really, I just didn't know how to release, but I was like, yeah, I cried a lot. And, but there's those pockets of it. And I, again, I'm not saying like, we need to cry like a river 24/7. That's not what I'm saying. But,
Right.
but like, I think one of the biggest things happening across cultures is that we are just taught to say we're fine, right? That's what you're saying. Like we lose friends. And there's this like hard piece, because I think inside all of us, we know that there's brokenness, that like, instead, like if we're just always cheerful and happy and everything's perfect, like, not that it's perfect, we're like, oh, I'm having a hard day, but people are okay with a little bit. But if you like actually go into the hard stuff, like it's tough for people to go there, because we're never meant to be broken. But yet, like in our brokenness here, we actually can be more beautiful, like you were saying, Jess. But I think that it's hard because we're always meant for joy and like goodness. But because of the death and sorrow and pain and trauma was never intended for us, but because we have it, we're feeling it, but it's okay to feel. So anyway, but I appreciate it, the depths of both that. So I don't know, I can't help but share, because I was like, wow, like, I just really appreciate what you're sharing.
Absolutely.
I got another thing. I just gotta say, forgiveness.
That's huge.
It's a huge beat.
With what I've been dealing with, there was 5 traumas that needed forgiveness attached. And it took me a while. I actually avoided having any contact with some of the people, one person that was at the hands of some of it. And I just couldn't talk to them. I couldn't even handle it. And it took me time to come to terms with it. And I'll never get an apology. It's okay. Like it's fine. But it's not fine. That's the wrong word. I've accepted that and I forgive anyway. And that is a big thing. And not just forgiving other people, but forgiving ourselves. Again, it's that release, so often we view forgiveness as a weakness in the world. Like I'm a doormat now, and it's not. It's such an incredible strength. To be able to let go.
That's good. Yeah, I like that. Yep, forgiveness. So you both talked on that. And and I would say the beginning steps, like you willingly, there's a time where we might, it's hard to get there. And then we say, yes, we have, but then there is a process because there's emotions behind it. So like I say, it's always a process, but to start saying, I want to forgive, right? I'm on the journey of forgiving is so important. Yeah. Because you're releasing and you're letting go for yourself. And it doesn't mean, I think a lot of people think forgiving is saying that nothing mattered, that it wasn't important. That's not true. It still shouldn't have happened. It was not it wasn't our fault, those who've had trauma, and it mattered and it was horrible. But what it does is it allows you, the person that was harmed, to be able to release the other person and also to move forward for yourself to become the better you that you deserve to be.
I view unforgiveness as chains. Chains keep you bound. And the unforgiveness keeps you bound to the trauma. It keeps you bound to the place where the trauma happened. It keeps you bound to the person you were during that trauma. It keeps you bound to the person that caused the trauma. Once you forgive, it breaks those chains and you can freely move on. And it's painful. Sometimes forgiveness is as painful as the trauma. But that's the only way to break those chains. It's the only way to come unbound. That's essential. And Chris didn't talk a lot about his childhood, and we didn't go into our childhood at all, but we didn't have it easy, and there's levels of forgiveness we had to walk through multiple years of counseling and deliverance and stuff to be able to say that boldly and not lightly, that if you ever message one of us with something traumatic, when whether it be abuse or whatever, we probably could say we understand. And so I'm not saying that ignorantly that forgiveness is somehow easy. It's not, but it's essential. For true healing, it is essential.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So thank you, Chris and Jess, for being on tonight. Audience, there's a lot of different opportunities to learn about, job, identity trauma, looking at the brain and trauma, and looking at different steps that Chris and Jess both talked about, as well as some of the practical encouragement and how to walk this out, and really looking at different ways that you can get support in your community or with other people, because it's always helpful, right? And so I appreciate that you bringing those dynamics. with that said, thank you, Chris and Jess, for being on. And as always, it's great to see you. Audience, if you have questions, you can certainly write them in the chat, and Chris and Jess or myself, we will look at them, be able to answer them. We would love to. And that would, again, if something touched you, you reached your heart and you have questions, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, you can catch Traumaplicity every week. You'll catch you in the new year next week in 2022. And yeah, I know. And we'll be meeting at 7:00 p.m. next week. So thank you again. Take care, everybody. Be well.
God bless.
All
God
right,
bless.
bye.
Bye.